Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're really digging into a pretty dense Supreme Court ruling.
The big one.
A huge one. And on the surface, it looks like just some, dry administrative fight over a pollution permit.
Right. But beneath all that legal language, the struggle is really about who pays to keep our water clean. And the stakes are, well, they're astronomical.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We're talking about the case City and County of San Francisco v. EPA.
And while the name on the case is San Francisco, this ruling just, it turned the whole regulatory world on its head overnight. It affects every city, every factory, anyone who discharges water.
And when you say astronomical stakes, give us a sense of scale.
Well, this whole thing kicked off because San Francisco was looking at a potential penalty in a related case that could have hit $10 billion.
$10 billion. Wow. That's not theoretical money. That's real taxpayer money.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's set the scene here. We're dealing with the foundation of U.S. water law, the Clean Water Act, or CWA.
And its main enforcement tool, which is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, the NPDES.
Right, and the basic idea is that it's illegal to discharge pollutants into U.S. waters unless you have a permit.
And that permit is supposed to have what are called effluent limitations.
So specific rules, like you can't discharge more than X amount of this particular chemical.
Typically, yes, very specific. You get a permit, it tells you the exact numbers you can't go over, and as long as you hit those numbers, you're good.
But the whole controversy here is about something different the EPA started putting in these permits, these end result requirements.
And that is a fundamental shift. It changes the entire game.
So instead of telling you what specific steps to take, they're just telling you what standard the river or the bay has to meet.
That's the conflict in a nutshell. The EPA says you must keep the water clean, instead of saying you must install this specific filter.
And San Francisco's argument was basically that the EPA doesn't have the legal authority to hand them a requirement that vague.
Especially one that could lead to, unpredictable and just financially crushing ruin.
To really get why San Francisco fought this so hard, we have to look at their plumbing problem. It's called combined sewer overflows, or CSOs.
Right. For anyone who doesn't think about city sewers all day.
Which is most of us.
It's an old design. You see it in a lot of older cities. Basically, the pipes that handle, raw sewage from homes and businesses are the very same pipes that handle all the stormwater running off the streets when it rains.
So it all gets mixed together.
All mixed together. Most of the time, that combined flow goes to a treatment plant. No problem.
But what happens when you get a really heavy rain?
The system is just instantly overwhelmed. There's way too much water. And to stop it from backing up into streets or even into people's basements...
It would be a nightmare.
A total nightmare. So the city has no choice but to discharge the excess. And that excess includes untreated wastewater, sometimes raw sewage, directly into the Pacific Ocean or the San Francisco Bay.
So that brings us to this specific permit fight back in 2019 at the city's Oceanside facility. The EPA added 2 new rules that the city just couldn't accept.
That's right. The first one said San Francisco couldn't have any discharge that contributes to a violation of any applicable water quality standard.
Okay, that sounds broad.
Very. And the second was similar, banning any discharge that creates pollution, contamination, or nuisance under California state law. These are those classic end result clauses we were talking about.
So let me make sure I'm getting the risk here. The city could follow every single specific technical rule in its permit, spend millions on all the right filters and tanks, but if a huge once-in-a-century storm hits and the bay's water quality drops for a while,
yes,
San Francisco could still be on the hook legally for contributing to that drop.
You have absolutely nailed the problem. The city argued this makes them the guarantor of the ocean's health, which is impossible.
So the legal question was, does the Clean Water Act actually give the EPA the power to shift that kind of massive risk onto a city?
And the Supreme Court majority came back with a very decisive no.
This is where it gets a little technical, but it's fascinating. The majority really zeroed in on the meaning of one word: limitation.
Right. It seems like a semantic argument, but it's really about who carries the risk of failure. The majority said a limitation has to be a restriction that's imposed from without.
What does that mean in plain English? Like a speed limit?
That's a perfect analogy. The government sets the speed limit, that's the external restriction, and your job is just to follow it.
But this end result rule is different.
Exactly. A rule that just says, make sure the bay is clean, forces the city, the permittee, to come up with its own internal plan to get to that result. The restriction is coming from within, from the city's own planning.
And the court said that's not how the law is supposed to work.
They said to implement the standards, the agency has to define concrete measures, not just order someone to achieve a result that could change with the weather.
It seems like a fine distinction, but the court connected it to the whole history of water regulation, right?
This is such a crucial point. Before the modern Clean Water Act in 1972, the old system was a disaster.
Why was that?
Because it was backward-looking. The government had to wait for a river to become polluted, and then they'd have to try and prove which specific factory or city was to blame.
Which, if you have dozens of pipes dumping into one river, must have been almost impossible.
An administrative nightmare. It just didn't work. So Congress deliberately threw that model out in '72 and moved to a system where regulators tell polluters what to do up front.
And the majority's point was that these end result rules would basically bring that old, failed system back from the dead.
Precisely. It would undo that entire historical shift.
So the message from the court to the EPA is, do your homework. Write clear, specific rules, because making cities guess how to avoid a billion-dollar fine is exactly what Congress was trying to stop.
It's all about predictability. And that brings us to the really big structural problems the court found with these rules. The first one is the permit shield.
The permit shield. This is the big promise in the Clean Water Act, right?
Yeah. It's the most valuable protection in the whole law for cities and industry. It says that if you comply with every term in your permit, you are automatically considered compliant with the entire Clean Water Act, period.
It's what gives them the confidence to go ahead and build these massive, expensive infrastructure projects.
That certainty is everything, because the fines are brutal. We're talking up to $25,000 a day per violation.
But the majority said these end result rules they destroy that protection. They use the word eviscerate.
They do. Think about it. San Francisco spends millions on upgrades the EPA required. They follow every single instruction. But an atmospheric river hits, the system overflows, and suddenly they're facing billions in fines.
For something that was largely out of their control.
Right. It turns the permit from a set of instructions into a liability trap. The shield becomes worthless.
And what was the second big structural flaw the court pointed to?
It's what they call the multi-discharger problem.
Yeah.
And this is really about fairness. Imagine a river with one big city sewage plant, a couple of large factories, and maybe, 20 smaller sources all discharging into it.
Right, a common scenario.
If the water quality in that river fails, and your permit just vaguely says, don't contribute to a violation, how do you possibly figure out who is responsible for what?
You can't. How does a judge say factory A is 15% to blame and the city is 30% to blame?
Yeah.
The math is impossible.
And the court made it clear that the law can't mean one thing for San Francisco, where they might be the only big discharger in one area, and something totally different in a crowded river basin. If the rule doesn't work there, it's not a valid rule anywhere.
So because of those two things, the destruction of the permit shield and this multi-discharger mess, the majority said the EPA has to stick to specific concrete rules.
That was the final word from the majority, yes.
Okay, that makes their position very clear. But this wasn't unanimous. 4 justices dissented, and they argued that this interpretation was way too narrow.
They really did. The dissent basically said the majority was getting lost in the weeds of one definition of limitation.
And they had some pretty relatable analogies to make their point.
Yeah, they were great. They said, look, if your doctor puts a limitation on you to lose 20 pounds,
right,
they aren't telling you how to do it. The specific diet, the exercise plan, that's up to you. You figure out the how.
Or the airline one.
Yeah.
The airline sets a weight limitation for your bag, but you decide what to pack to meet that limit.
Exactly. So the dissent's view was that a limitation can be general, and they were focused on the real-world pollution that was still happening.
They pointed to some pretty graphic examples, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They stressed that these end result rules are necessary to meet water quality standards when the technology-based rules fall short. They cited things like discoloration, scum, and floating material, including toilet paper, in Mission Creek.
So even with all the specific rules, there was still obvious pollution.
Yes. The concrete rules were failing to prevent the obvious.
And the dissent had a pretty compelling reason for why the EPA uses these broader rules in the first place.
They did. It's often because the agency just lacks the information it needs to write those super specific, tailored rules. They're required by law to protect water quality, but they need data from the cities to do it.
And in this case, they pointed a finger at San Francisco.
They did. They noted that San Francisco hadn't updated its key long-term control plan since 1991, so the EPA felt like its hands were tied.
So the dissent solution wasn't to just throw out the EPA's tool entirely.
No, not at all. They said if a rule is unfair or vague in a specific situation, like with multiple dischargers, then the city should sue and argue it's arbitrary and capricious.
Use the existing legal safety valve.
Right. Don't take the tool away from the EPA everywhere. They warned that if you do that, the EPA might just start delaying or denying permits altogether because they still have that legal duty to make sure water standards are met.
So after all that, where do we land? What's the big takeaway here for all of us?
Well, the Supreme Court reversed the Ninth Circuit. So those end result requirements, as they were written here, they're out.
Gone.
Gone. And that is a huge win for, predictability. The burden is now placed firmly back on the EPA and the state agencies to be prescriptive and detailed.
So cities, taxpayers, businesses, they're protected now from these huge, unpredictable fines for things that might be totally out of their control.
Yeah.
If you follow the rules, the government writes down.
You are safe. The entire system now depends on the government doing its homework first. And the majority actually said as much in the opinion.
What was the quote?
They wrote, "If the EPA does its work, our holdings should have no adverse effect on water quality."
That is the $10 billion mandate right there. Which leads to a final really important question for you, the listener, to think about. Now that the burden of creating these detailed concrete measures is back on the regulatory agencies that are often facing staff shortages and budget cuts, what happens now? If they're slow to generate all the data they need to write these perfect prescriptive permits, will our water quality actually suffer from a kind of regulatory paralysis? Or will this legal push finally create the better, more effective regulation that Congress wanted all those decades ago?
A truly challenging question. It forces the regulators to adapt, and adapt quickly.
Indeed. Something to mull over as we all watch the next phase of this very technical but very important clean water battle. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.